The rain fell hard that evening, drumming against the tin roof of the small house at the edge of the village, each drop a reminder of how much had changed and how much had been lost. Inside, beneath the flickering glow of a single kerosene lamp, Marissa sat on the edge of a wooden stool, her hands rough and calloused from years of labor, her fingers threading through the worn fabric of a dress she had been mending for hours. The dress was not hers. It belonged to her daughter, Ava, who had outgrown it years ago but still kept it tucked away in a corner of the wardrobe, a relic of simpler times when they had nothing but each other, and somehow that had been enough. Marissa's eyes, tired and lined with the weight of sleepless nights and endless worry, lingered on the stitches she made, each one careful and deliberate, as if by mending the fabric she could somehow mend the distance that had begun to grow between them. She did not know it yet, but this distance would soon become a chasm so wide that no amount of love or sacrifice could bridge it. Ava had always been different. Even as a child, she had carried herself with a quiet determination, a fire in her eyes that spoke of dreams far bigger than the dusty roads and crumbling houses of their village. Marissa had nurtured that fire, pouring every coin she earned into Ava's education, into her future, into the hope that one day her daughter would escape the poverty that had swallowed so many others. She had worked her fingers to the bone, scrubbing floors in the homes of the wealthy, washing clothes until her back ached and her hands bled, selling vegetables at the market under the scorching sun, all so that Ava could attend the best schools, wear clean uniforms, and sit among children whose parents never had to choose between buying food or paying school fees. Marissa never complained. She never let Ava see the tears she cried in the dark, the nights she went to bed hungry so her daughter could eat, the shame she felt when the other mothers whispered behind her back, calling her foolish for investing so much in a girl who would eventually marry and leave. But Marissa believed. She believed that education was the key, that knowledge was power, and that one day, Ava would rise above it all and build a life so beautiful that the suffering would have been worth it. And Ava did rise. She excelled in school, her sharp mind and relentless ambition propelling her forward, earning her scholarships and opportunities that seemed almost miraculous. She moved to the city after finishing secondary school, securing a place at a prestigious university, and then later, a job at a renowned marketing firm where she rubbed shoulders with the elite, the polished, the powerful. She learned to speak their language, to dress in their style, to carry herself with the kind of confidence that came not from struggle but from privilege. She learned to hide the village in her voice, to smooth out the rough edges, to erase the traces of poverty that clung to her like dust. And slowly, imperceptibly, she began to see her past not as a testament to her mother's love and sacrifice, but as a source of shame, a reminder of everything she had left behind and everything she wanted to forget. It started with small things. Ava stopped visiting as often, claiming she was too busy with work, too caught up in meetings and deadlines and the demands of her new life. When she did visit, she no longer stayed long, her eyes constantly darting to her phone, her mind already elsewhere. She stopped sharing stories about her day, stopped asking about Marissa's health, stopped sitting with her in the evenings to watch the sun set over the hills. She brought expensive gifts, designer handbags and silk scarves and imported perfumes, as if money could replace presents, as if material things could fill the void that was growing between them. Marissa accepted the gifts with a smile, though they felt heavy in her hands, and she never wore the scarves or used the perfumes because they seemed too delicate, too precious for someone like her. She told herself that Ava was just adjusting, that the city was overwhelming, that her daughter needed time to find her footing in this new world. She told herself that the love was still there, buried beneath the surface, waiting to resurface when the chaos settled. She told herself these things because the alternative was too painful to consider. Then Dylan came into the picture. He was everything Ava had ever dreamed of. Tall, handsome, wealthy beyond measure, the heir to a business empire that spanned continents. He drove luxury cars, wore tailored suits, and spoke with the kind of effortless charm that came from a lifetime of privilege. He noticed Ava at a corporate event, captivated by her beauty and her intelligence, and he pursued her with the kind of intensity that made her feel like the most important person in the world. Within months, they were inseparable. Within a year, he proposed, presenting her with a diamond ring so large it seemed almost vulgar, and Ava said yes without hesitation, her heart soaring with the certainty that she had finally arrived, that she had finally become someone worth noticing. She called Marissa that night, her voice breathless with excitement, and Marissa wept tears of joy, thanking God for blessing her daughter with such happiness, such fortune. But even then, even in that moment of pure elation, there was a seed of unease planted in Marissa's heart, a quiet voice whispering that something was not quite right, That happiness built on appearances was fragile. That love rooted in shame could not endure. Dylan's family was not like Ava's. They lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, a place of marble floors and crystal chandeliers and manicured gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. His mother, Mrs. Hawthorne, was a woman of sharp features and sharper words, a matriarch who ruled her household with an iron fist and expected perfection from everyone around her. She had not been pleased when Dylan announced his engagement to Ava. She had made inquiries, discreet but thorough, and had discovered that Ava came from nothing, that her mother was a common laborer, that there was no family name, no legacy, no wealth to speak of. Mrs. Hawthorne had confronted Dylan privately, urging him to reconsider, to find someone more suitable, someone whose background matched his own. But Dylan, for all his privilege, was stubborn, and he loved Ava in his own way, or at least he loved the idea of her, the image she projected, the person she had become. He insisted on the marriage, and Mrs. Hawthorne, though displeased, relented, though her disapproval hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and ominous. Ava felt the weight of that disapproval from the moment she stepped into the Hawthorne mansion. She saw it in the way Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes swept over her, assessing, judging, finding her lacking. She heard it in the polite but distant tone of her voice, the way she addressed Ava as if she were a guest rather than a future member of the family. She sensed it in the questions Mrs. Hawthorne asked, questions about Ava's education, her career, her plans for the future, questions that seemed innocent on the surface but carried an underlying skepticism, a suggestion that Ava was not good enough, that she would never be good enough. And Ava, desperate to prove herself, desperate to belong, began to construct a new identity, a carefully curated version of herself that had no connection to the village, to the poverty, to Marissa. She told the Hawthornes that her mother was elderly and frail, that she lived quietly in the countryside, that she preferred solitude. She painted a picture of a woman who was respectable but distant, someone who would not embarrass her, someone who could be kept at arm's length. And Marissa, who knew nothing of these lies, continued to sew and clean and save, planning for the wedding, dreaming of the day she would see her daughter walk down the aisle, the culmination of every sacrifice she had ever made. "Mama, I need to talk to you about the wedding," Ava said one afternoon, her voice carefully measured, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her mind. She sat across from Marissa in the small living room, her posture stiff, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and there was something in her eyes that Marissa could not quite read, something distant and guarded that made her mother's heart clench with an inexplicable fear. Marissa had been peeling cassava, her fingers working automatically, rhythmically, the way they had for decades, but now she set down the knife and wiped her hands on her wrapper, giving Ava her full attention. She smiled, that warm, hopeful smile that had carried them through so many hard times, and nodded for her daughter to continue, unaware that the words about to leave Ava's mouth would begin the unraveling of everything they had built together. Ava cleared her throat, and for a moment she could not meet her mother's eyes. She looked instead at the worn furniture, the faded curtains, the cracked walls that she had once called home, but now saw only as evidence of everything she was trying to escape. She thought of the Hawthorne mansion with its pristine elegance, of Mrs. Hawthorne's sharp scrutiny, of the way Dylan's friends spoke in hushed tones about pedigree and lineage and social standing. She thought of the wedding that was being planned, a grand affair with hundreds of guests, elaborate decorations, imported flowers, a reception at the most exclusive hotel in the city, and she thought of her mother standing among those people in her simple clothes and worn shoes, her hands marked by labor, her accent thick with the village, and shame washed over her like a wave, hot and suffocating and impossible to resist. She had convinced herself that she was protecting her mother, that she was sparing her the discomfort of feeling out of place, but deep down, in the part of her heart she refused to acknowledge, she knew the truth. She was ashamed. "The wedding is going to be very formal, Mama," Ava began, her voice steady but lacking warmth. "Dylan's family has very specific expectations, and there will be a lot of important people there. Business associates, politicians, society people. It's going to be overwhelming, and I know you're not used to that kind of environment." She paused, watching Marissa's face for a reaction, but her mother only listened, her expression open and trusting, waiting to understand where this was leading. Ava pressed on, her words coming faster now, as if speed could soften the blow. "I've been thinking that maybe it would be better if you didn't come to the ceremony itself. I know how much you've looked forward to this, but I don't want you to feel uncomfortable or out of place. These people can be very judgmental, and I don't want them to make you feel unwelcome. Maybe you could come to a smaller celebration afterward, something more intimate, just family. Wouldn't that be nicer for you?" The words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, Marissa said nothing. She sat very still, her hands resting in her lap, her face a mask of confusion as her mind struggled to process what she had just heard. Had she misunderstood? Was Ava really suggesting that she, the woman who had raised her alone, who had sacrificed everything, who had dreamed of this day for years, should not attend her own daughter's wedding? The silence stretched, thick and heavy, and Ava shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flickering toward the door as if she might escape before her mother could respond. But then Marissa spoke, her voice soft, almost tentative, as if she were afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile hope remained. Ava, sweetheart, I don't understand. This is your wedding. I've been saving for months to buy a new dress to make sure I could be there for you. Why would I not come? I don't care if I feel out of place. I just want to see you happy. I want to be there when you say your vows. Ava's jaw tightened, and a flash of irritation crossed her face, though she tried to suppress it. She had expected resistance, but she had hoped her mother would simply accept the suggestion, would trust that Ava knew best. Instead, Marissa was making this difficult, making her feel guilty, and Ava resented that. She resented the way her mother's simple goodness made her own selfishness so glaringly obvious. "Mama, you're not listening," she said, her tone sharper now. "This isn't about what I want. This is about what's best for everyone. Dylan's mother already has concerns about my background, and I need to show her that I can fit into their world. If you're there, dressed like this." She gestured vaguely at Marissa's clothing, and the gesture felt like a slap. "People will talk, they'll judge me, they'll say I'm not good enough. I've worked so hard to get here, Mama. I can't let anything ruin this." Marissa felt something crack inside her chest, a sharp, physical pain that radiated outward, stealing her breath. She stared at her daughter, this young woman she had poured her life into, and she barely recognized her. When had Ava become someone who measured love by appearances? When had she started seeing her own mother as a liability, an embarrassment, something to be hidden away? Tears pricked at Marissa's eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. She had cried enough tears over the years, tears of exhaustion and worry and fear, but she had always cried alone in the dark, where Ava could not see. She would not cry now, not when her daughter needed to see the depth of the hurt she was causing. "Is that what I am to you now?" Marissa asked quietly, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. "An embarrassment, something to be ashamed of. I thought you understood, Ava. I thought you knew that everything I did, every sacrifice I made was for you. I wore these clothes because I spent my money on your school fees, not on myself. I worked these jobs because I wanted you to have opportunities I never had. And now you tell me that because of that, because I loved you too much, I'm not good enough to stand beside you on the most important day of your life." Ava's face hardened, her defenses rising, and she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're being dramatic, Mama," she said, her voice cold now, devoid of the warmth and affection that had once defined their relationship. "This isn't about you. This is about me and my future. If you really loved me, you would understand that. You would want what's best for me, even if it means staying home for one day." She grabbed her purse from the table, her movements brisk and final, and headed toward the door, not waiting for a response, not giving Marissa a chance to say anything more. But as her hand touched the doorknob, Marissa's voice, soft and broken, reached her one last time. "I do want what's best for you, Ava. I always have, but I'm starting to wonder if you even know what that is anymore." Ava paused, her hand frozen on the door, and for a fleeting second, something like regret flickered across her face. But then she pushed it down, buried it beneath layers of justification and denial, and walked out without looking back. Marissa sat alone in the silence that followed, the cassava forgotten on the table, her hands trembling in her lap. She stared at the door her daughter had just walked through, and she felt a profound loneliness settle over her, a loneliness that had nothing to do with being physically alone and everything to do with the realization that the person she loved most in the world no longer saw her, no longer valued her, no longer needed her in the way she once had. She thought of all the years she had spent building Ava's future, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, and she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Not in loving her daughter, never that, but in believing that love alone would be enough to keep them together. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of frantic preparation and mounting tension. Ava threw herself into the planning with an almost manic intensity, attending meetings with the wedding planner, approving floral arrangements, selecting the perfect menu, ensuring that every detail was flawless. She wanted this wedding to be perfect, not just for herself and Dylan, but for the Hawthorns, for the society pages, for everyone who had ever doubted her. She wanted to prove that she belonged, that she was worthy, that her past did not define her. And in her determination to create this perfect image, she distanced herself even further from Marissa, ignoring her calls, making excuses when her mother tried to visit, convincing herself that it was better this way, that the separation was temporary and necessary. Dylan noticed the change in Ava, the way she seemed constantly on edge, the way she snapped at small inconveniences and obsessed over trivial details. But when he asked if something was wrong, she brushed him off, insisting that it was just wedding stress, that everything was fine. And he believed her, or perhaps he simply chose not to press, too wrapped up in his own life to see the cracks forming in hers. Mrs. Hawthorne, meanwhile, watched Ava with a calculating eye, noting the desperation in her efforts to please, the way she deferred to the Hawthorne preferences, the way she seemed willing to mold herself into whatever shape was required. It did not endear Ava to her. If anything, it confirmed Mrs. Hawthorne's initial assessment that this girl was not of their world, that she was pretending, that she lacked the inherent confidence that came from generations of privilege. But Mrs. Hawthorne said nothing. She allowed the wedding preparations to continue, her silence more damning than any outright disapproval, and Ava, misinterpreting that silence as grudging acceptance, pushed herself even harder, determined to win her future mother-in-law's respect. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky so clear and blue it seemed almost cruel in its perfection, as if the heavens themselves had conspired to create the ideal backdrop for a day that would shatter lives and expose the fragility of love built on lies. The city awakened slowly, the streets filling with the hum of traffic and the voices of vendors setting up their stalls. But in the grand hotel where the ceremony would take place, everything was already in motion. Workers moved like ants, arranging white roses and orchids imported from abroad, draping silk and tulle across chairs and archways, polishing silverware until it gleamed, transforming the ballroom into a vision of opulence that would be photographed and admired and talked about for months to come. Ava stood in the bridal suite on the top floor, surrounded by makeup artists and hairdressers and bridesmaids who fussed over every detail, and she looked at herself in the floor-length mirror, hardly recognizing the woman staring back. Her dress was a masterpiece of lace and beading, custom-made by a designer whose name alone carried weight, and her hair was swept into an elegant updo, adorned with tiny crystals that caught the light with every movement. She looked like a princess, like someone who had always belonged in this world of wealth and privilege, and yet beneath the flawless makeup and the radiant smile she had practiced until it felt natural, there was a hollowness, a gnawing sense that something essential was missing. She had not spoken to Marissa in 2 weeks. After their last conversation, after the words that had cut so deeply neither of them knew how to heal the wound, Ava had avoided her mother entirely, sending brief text messages to say she was busy, that the wedding planning was consuming all her time, that they would talk after everything settled down. Marissa had stopped trying to call after the 5th unanswered attempt, and the silence between them had grown thick and oppressive, a wall that neither seemed able or willing to break through. Ava told herself it was better this way, that once the wedding was over and she was securely part of the Hawthorne family, she could mend things with her mother, could explain that it had all been necessary, that sacrifices had to be made for the greater good. She told herself that Marissa would understand, that mothers always forgave, that love was resilient enough to survive temporary betrayal. But deep down, in the quiet moments when she was alone with her thoughts, a voice whispered that she had crossed a line from which there was no return, that some hurts could not be undone, that the woman in the mirror was a stranger even to herself. Marissa had risen before dawn that morning, her body moving on instinct despite the heaviness in her heart. She had ironed the dress she had bought with money saved over months, a simple but dignified garment in deep blue that made her feel, for perhaps the first time in years, like someone worthy of standing in a room full of important people. She had polished her only pair of good shoes until they shone, and she had tied her headscarf with care, choosing the pattern that Ava had always said brought out the warmth in her eyes. She did all of this even though Ava had told her not to come, even though the invitation had been rescinded, even though every rational part of her mind told her that showing up would only cause more pain. But Marissa was a mother, and mothers did not abandon their children, not even when their children abandoned them. She believed, perhaps naively, that if she could just see Ava, just look into her eyes on this most important of days, something would shift, some recognition of their bond would resurface, and they would find their way back to each other. She believed in the power of presence, in the unspoken language of love that transcended words and wounds. And so she made her way to the city, taking the bus that wound through the countryside and into the sprawling urban landscape, clutching her small purse in her lap and praying silently that her daughter would forgive her for coming uninvited. The hotel lobby was a cathedral of marble and glass, soaring ceilings and chandeliers that sparkled like captured starlight, and Marissa felt impossibly small as she stepped through the revolving doors. Everywhere she looked, there were people dressed in elegant suits and flowing gowns, their laughter light and confident, their movements assured, and she became acutely aware of how different she looked, how out of place she was in this world that her daughter now inhabited. She approached the reception desk, her voice quiet and hesitant as she explained that she was the bride's mother, that she had come for the wedding, and the receptionist, a young woman with perfect makeup and a polite but distant smile, checked the guest list and frowned. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her tone professional but firm. "Your name isn't on the list. Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" Marissa's heart sank, but she nodded, insisting gently that there must have been a mistake, that of course she was invited, that she was Ava's mother and surely her daughter would want her there. The receptionist looked uncomfortable, glancing toward the security guard stationed near the entrance, and Marissa felt a cold dread creeping up her spine, the realization that Ava had not simply discouraged her from coming, but had actively ensured she would be turned away. Before the situation could escalate, another hotel staff member appeared, a manager who had been briefed on the wedding and its notable guests, and he recognized immediately that this woman, with her simple dress and uncertain demeanor, was not part of the approved attendee list. He approached Marissa with a smile that did not reach his eyes, his voice smooth and practiced as he explained that the ceremony was a private event, that only those on the guest list could proceed to the ballroom, and that perhaps there had been some confusion. Marissa tried to explain again, her voice rising slightly with desperation, that she was the mother of the bride, that there had to be some way to contact Ava to let her know she was here. But the manager was already signaling to the security guard, his patience wearing thin, and Marissa felt tears beginning to sting her eyes, humiliation washing over her in waves as she realized she was being treated like an intruder, like someone who did not belong, like someone whose presence was unwanted and unwelcome in her own daughter's life. Upstairs, Ava was putting the finishing touches on her makeup when one of the Hawthorne assistants knocked on the door and entered with a troubled expression. "Miss Ava," she said carefully, her voice low so the others in the room would not hear, "there's a woman downstairs claiming to be your mother. She's not on the guest list and security is asking what they should do." Ava's hand froze, the lipstick she had been applying hovering in midair, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Marissa would respect her wishes, that she would stay home and let Ava have this day without complication. But of course her mother had come. Of course she had ignored the unspoken command and shown up anyway, because that was what Marissa did. She loved without conditions and without boundaries, and right now that love felt like a noose tightening around Ava's throat. She could feel the eyes of her bridesmaids on her, could sense their curiosity and confusion, and she knew that if she acknowledged Marissa now, if she allowed her mother into the ballroom, questions would be asked, judgments would be made, and everything she had worked so hard to build would crumble. Mrs. Hawthorne would hear about it, Dylan's friends would whisper about it, and the perfect image she had crafted would be shattered. Ava's mind raced, panic and shame and anger colliding in a storm of emotion, and then before she could think clearly, before she could consider the full weight of what she was about to do, she made a decision. "Tell security to remove her," she said, her voice cold and detached, as if she were talking about a stranger rather than the woman who had given her life. "She's not supposed to be here. Make sure she doesn't cause a scene." The assistant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the instruction, but Ava's tone left no room for argument, and after a moment the woman nodded and left the room. Ava turned back to the mirror, forcing her hands to steady as she finished applying her lipstick, but the face staring back at her looked pale and hollow, and somewhere deep inside, a small voice screamed that she had just made the worst mistake of her life. Downstairs, Marissa was still trying to reason with the security guard when she saw him approach, his expression apologetic but firm, and she knew before he spoke what was about to happen. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, his hand hovering near her elbow as if preparing to escort her out physically if necessary. "This is a private event, and you're not authorized to be here." Marissa looked at him, her eyes filling with tears that she could no longer hold back, and she shook her head, her voice breaking as she pleaded one last time. "Please, I just want to see my daughter, just for a moment, please." But the guard was already guiding her toward the door, his grip gentle but unyielding, and Marissa stumbled forward, her vision blurred by tears, her heart breaking in a way she had never imagined possible. As she was led through the lobby, past the elegant guests who paused to watch with expressions ranging from pity to disdain, she felt the full weight of her daughter's rejection, the finality of it, the cruelty of it, and she wondered how love could transform so completely into something that felt like hatred. What Marissa did not know What she could not have known as she was being escorted through the gleaming hotel lobby, with tears streaming down her face and her dignity stripped away in front of strangers, was that someone had been watching. A young woman, a guest who had arrived early and was seated in one of the plush chairs near the entrance, had witnessed the entire scene unfold. She had watched Marissa plead with the receptionist, had seen the desperation in her eyes as she explained that she was the mother of the bride, had observed the cold efficiency with which security removed her from the building, as if she were a trespasser rather than family. And this young woman, moved by something she could not quite name, perhaps a sense of injustice or perhaps simple human compassion, had pulled out her phone and recorded the final moments of Marissa's removal, capturing the way her shoulders shook with silent sobs, the way she clutched her purse to her chest, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world, the way she looked back one last time toward the elevator that would have taken her to her daughter. The video was only 43 seconds long, but within those seconds was contained a story so powerful, so heartbreaking, that it would ignite a firestorm that no one, least of all Ava, could have anticipated. The ceremony proceeded exactly as planned. The ballroom was filled with hundreds of guests who had come to witness the union of Dylan Hawthorne and Ava, and they gasped appropriately when Ava appeared at the entrance, resplendent in her designer gown, her smile radiant as she walked down the aisle on the arm of a family friend who had agreed to give her away in the absence of a father. Dylan stood at the altar watching her approach, his expression one of genuine admiration, and for a moment, as their eyes met, Ava felt a flicker of something that might have been happiness if not for the shadow of what she had just done lurking at the edges of her consciousness. The efficient spoken measured, solemn tones about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage, and Ava repeated her vows mechanically, the words flowing from her lips without truly touching her heart. She could not stop thinking about her mother, about the image of Marissa being led away, and she told herself again and again that it had been necessary, that it would all be worth it, that once this day was over she could find a way to make amends. But even as she thought these things, she knew they were lies, hollow justifications for an act of cruelty that could never be undone. The reception that followed was a spectacle of excess and celebration. Champagne flowed freely, the band played music that had guests dancing and laughing, and toast after toast was made to the happy couple, each speech more effusive than the last. Ava moved through the crowd in a daze, accepting congratulations and compliments, her face aching from the effort of maintaining her smile. Mrs. Hawthorne observed her from across the room, her expression unreadable, and Ava could not tell whether she had won her mother-in-law's approval or whether the woman was simply tolerating her presence. Dylan, loosened by alcohol and the euphoria of the day, was attentive and affectionate, pulling Ava onto the dance floor and whispering in her ear that she was the most beautiful bride he had ever seen. And for a few brief hours, Ava allowed herself to believe that she had succeeded, that she had secured her place in this world, that the cost of her ambition had been justified by the rewards. But the internet moves faster than human emotion, and while Ava danced and smiled and pretended that everything was perfect, the video of Marissa's removal was already spreading across social media like wildfire. The young woman who had recorded it had posted it with a caption that read, "The bride had her own mother thrown out of her wedding. This broke my heart." Within an hour, the video had been shared 1,000 times. Within 3 hours, it had reached 50,000 views. By the time the reception ended and Ava and Dylan retired to their honeymoon suite, exhausted but satisfied, the video had gone viral, amassing millions of views and sparking outrage across every platform. People who had never met Ava, who knew nothing about her life or her struggles, watched those 43 seconds and formed instant, visceral judgments. They saw a poor woman being humiliated, a mother being rejected, and they responded with anger and condemnation that was both fierce and unforgiving. Comments flooded in by the thousands, each one more scathing than the last, calling Ava heartless, ungrateful, wicked, a disgrace. Her name was shared, her photos were circulated, and within hours, the story had been picked up by news outlets and bloggers who saw in it a symbol of everything wrong with society, a cautionary tale about ambition and shame and the consequences of forgetting where you came from. Ava knew none of this when she woke up the next morning in the luxurious hotel suite, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Dylan still asleep beside her. She reached for her phone out of habit, intending to scroll through the wedding photos that guests had surely posted, eager to see how the day had been documented, how she and Dylan looked in the eyes of the world. But when she unlocked her screen, she was greeted not with congratulatory messages, but with a barrage of notifications that made her stomach drop. Her social media accounts were flooded with mentions, her inbox overflowing with messages from people she did not know, and as she began to read them, her hands started to shake. "How could you do that to your own mother?" one message read. "You're disgusting," said another. "Karma is coming for you," warned a third. She scrolled frantically, trying to understand what was happening, and then she saw it, the video. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched herself, or rather watched the consequences of her decision played out for the world to see. There was her mother, tears streaming down her face, being led away by security, and there in the background, barely visible, was Ava's name on the wedding program displayed on an easel near the entrance. The connection was unmistakable. The internet had identified her, exposed her, and now she was being tried and convicted in the court of public opinion with a swiftness and severity that left her reeling. She sat frozen, the phone trembling in her hands, unable to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. Dylan stirred beside her, waking slowly, and when he saw her face pale and stricken, he asked what was wrong. Ava could not speak. She simply handed him the phone, and as he watched the video, his expression shifted from confusion to horror to something darker, something that looked almost like disgust. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "Did you really have your mother removed from the wedding?" Ava wanted to explain, wanted to justify her actions, but the words stuck in her throat because there was no explanation that would make this right, no justification that would erase what she had done. I didn't know anyone was recording," she stammered, and Dylan's face hardened. "That's what you're worried about," he said, his voice rising. "Not that you did it, but that you got caught." He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair, pacing the room, and Ava could see the gears turning in his mind, could see him calculating the damage this would do to his reputation, to his family's name. Within hours, Ava's life began to unravel with a speed and totality that felt surreal. Her employer, a prestigious marketing firm that valued its public image above all else, called her that afternoon to inform her that her services were no longer required. They cited the negative attention she had brought to the company, the way her actions reflected poorly on their brand, and they terminated her contract effective immediately. Friends who had celebrated with her just the day before began to distance themselves, their calls going unanswered, their messages brief and cold, as if association with her had become toxic. Social media continued its relentless assault, with strangers dissecting every aspect of her life, digging up old photos, speculating about her character, creating memes and parodies that painted her as the villain in a morality tale that was being told and retold across the internet. Ava deleted her accounts, but the damage was done. The video had taken on a life of its own, and no amount of hiding could make it disappear. Dylan grew increasingly distant as the days passed. His mother, Mrs. Hawthorne, had called him in a fury, demanding to know why he had not told her about Ava's background, why he had allowed this woman with such questionable character into their family. She had seen the video, had read the comments, and she was mortified by the association. Dylan, caught between his new wife and his formidable mother, began to view Ava not with the love and admiration he had felt on their wedding day, but with suspicion and resentment. He started noticing things he had overlooked before, the way Ava was always so eager to please, so desperate for approval, the way she seemed to have no real identity of her own, only a carefully constructed facade. And he began to wonder who he had really married, whether the woman he thought he knew had ever truly existed. Arguments erupted between them, bitter and accusatory, with Dylan questioning Ava's integrity and Ava defending herself with increasing desperation. The honeymoon they had planned, a 2-week trip to the Maldives, was cancelled. The dream life Ava had envisioned was crumbling before it had even begun. Then came the accusation that would seal her fate. Mrs. Hawthorne, searching for a way to sever the connection between her family and this woman who had brought them such embarrassment, claimed that a valuable piece of jewelry, a diamond bracelet that had been in the Hawthorne family for generations, had gone missing. She suggested, with thinly veiled insinuation, that Ava might know something about its whereabouts. The accusation was absurd, baseless, but in the climate of suspicion and hostility that now surrounded Ava, it was taken seriously. Dylan, influenced by his mother's poison and his own growing doubts, confronted Ava with cold fury, demanding that she return the bracelet. Ava, stunned and horrified, insisted that she had never even seen the bracelet, that she had no idea what he was talking about, but her protests fell on deaf ears. Mrs. Hawthorne filed a police report, and though there was no evidence linking Ava to the supposed theft, the accusation alone was enough to destroy what little remained of her reputation and her marriage. Dylan asked her to leave. He did not yell or rage. He simply told her, in a voice devoid of emotion, that their marriage had been a mistake, that he could not be with someone he did not trust, someone who had brought such shame and chaos into his life. He gave her 24 hours to pack her belongings and vacate the apartment they had been preparing to move into together. Ava, broken and disbelieving, tried to reason with him, tried to make him see that the theft accusation was a fabrication, but he turned away from her, his face a mask of indifference. She had nowhere to go. Her savings were depleted from wedding expenses, her job was gone, her friends had abandoned her, and the apartment she had rented before the marriage had already been given to someone else. She packed what she could carry in a single suitcase, and as she walked out of the Hawthorne mansion for the last time, she felt the full weight of her fall, from the heights of privilege and acceptance to the depths of rejection and despair. How does a person survive when everything they have built, everything they believe themselves to be, collapses in the space of a few days? Ava did not know the answer to this question as she stood on the street outside the Hawthorne mansion, her single suitcase at her feet, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly as if mocking her predicament. She had no money beyond the few bills in her wallet, no place to go, no one to call who would answer with anything other than judgment or indifference. The city that had once seemed full of promise and opportunity now felt hostile and unwelcoming, its towers of glass and steel looming over her like silent witnesses to her disgrace. She thought about calling one of her former colleagues, someone she had considered a friend, but pride and shame stopped her. She could not bear to hear the pity in their voices, or worse, the satisfaction at seeing someone who had climbed so high fall so far. And so she walked, dragging her suitcase behind her, with no destination in mind, only the vague sense that she needed to keep moving, that stopping would mean confronting the full horror of what her life had become. For 3 nights, Ava slept in cheap motels on the outskirts of the city, the kind of places where no one asked questions and payment was accepted in cash. She rationed her remaining money carefully, buying the cheapest food she could find, skipping meals when necessary, trying to make it last as long as possible while she figured out her next move. But there was no next move. Every door she had counted on was now closed. She applied for jobs online, but her name had become too recognizable, too tainted by scandal, and employers who might have considered her application days earlier now rejected her without explanation. She tried reaching out to distant relatives, cousins she had not spoken to in years, but they either did not respond or offered vague excuses about why they could not help. The viral video followed her everywhere, a digital scarlet letter that ensured her shame was never forgotten, never forgiven. She began to understand, in a way she never had before, what it meant to be truly alone, to have no safety net, no support system, nothing but the consequences of her own choices bearing down on her with crushing weight. On the 4th night, sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress in a room that smelled of mildew and desperation, Ava finally allowed herself to cry in a way she had not permitted since childhood. Not the delicate, controlled tears she had shed when things did not go her way, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of profound anguish and regret. She cried for her mother, for the woman who had loved her without condition and whom she had repaid with cruelty and rejection. She cried for herself, for the person she had become, someone so consumed by ambition and insecurity that she had lost sight of what truly mattered. She cried for the life she had destroyed, not the glamorous existence with Dylan and the Hawthorns, but the simple, genuine connection she had shared with Marissa before she allowed shame to poison it. And as the tears finally subsided, leaving her exhausted and hollow, a single thought crystallized in her mind with startling clarity: she had to go home. Not to reclaim anything, not to ask for forgiveness she did not deserve, but simply because there was nowhere else left to go, and because facing her mother was the only honest thing she had left to do. The journey back to the village felt longer than any distance Ava had ever traveled. She took a series of buses, each one older and more worn than the last, watching through grimy windows as the city gave way to suburbs and then to countryside, the landscape transforming from concrete and chaos to open fields and scattered houses that marked the edges of rural life. Other passengers glanced at her curiously, noting her clothes that were too fine for bus travel, her face that bore the unmistakable marks of sleeplessness and suffering, but no one spoke to her, and she was grateful for the silence. She rehearsed 1,000 different speeches in her mind, trying to find words that could possibly express the depth of her remorse, the magnitude of her mistake, but every phrase sounded hollow and inadequate. How could language capture the transformation that had occurred within her, the shattering of her arrogance, the dawning realization that everything she had chased was worthless compared to what she had thrown away? She could not articulate it, and so she simply resolved to say nothing, to let her presence speak for itself, to accept whatever judgment her mother chose to render. When Ava finally walked up the familiar dirt path to the small house where she had been raised, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of countless evenings spent sitting on the porch with Marissa, talking about her dreams, making plans for a future that seemed so bright and possible. The house looked exactly as she remembered it, humble and worn but maintained with care, and as she stood before the door, her hand raised to knock, she was overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked her to her knees. This was where she belonged. This was home. Not the mansion with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, not the luxury apartment she had never got to live in, but this simple structure with its corrugated roof and cracked walls, because this was where love lived, where sacrifice had been made on her behalf, where a woman had given everything so her daughter could have a chance at something better. Ava knocked softly, and after a moment that felt like an eternity, the door opened. Marissa stood in the doorway, and the sight of her made Ava's breath catch. Her mother looked older, more tired than Ava remembered, the lines around her eyes deeper, her shoulders carrying a weight that had not been there before. But when Marissa saw who was standing on her doorstep, her expression shifted through a series of emotions too quick to name: surprise, pain, confusion, and then something that looked almost like relief. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other, mother and daughter, separated by hurts too fresh and wounds too deep for easy reconciliation. Then Ava, her voice breaking, said the only words she could manage: "Mama, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Marissa's eyes filled with tears, but she did not immediately open her arms or offer absolution. Instead, she stepped aside, gesturing for Ava to enter, and her voice when she spoke was soft but carried an undercurrent of pain that could not be hidden. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." And in that simple statement was contained both the unconditional love that had always defined Marissa and the acknowledgement that something fundamental had broken between them, something that would take more than apologies to repair. Ava entered the house that had once been her entire world and now felt both familiar and foreign, and she sat at the small wooden table where she had eaten countless meals, where she had done her homework while Marissa prepared dinner after long days of work, where they had shared stories and laughter and the quiet contentment of being together. Marissa moved around the kitchen preparing food, her movements automatic and practiced, and Ava watched her in silence, noticing things she had never paid attention to before: the way her mother's hands trembled slightly from years of hard labor, the care with which she arranged even the simplest meal, the dignity she maintained despite having every reason to turn her daughter away. When the food was ready, Marissa set a plate before Ava, and only then did she sit down across from her, folding her hands in her lap and looking at her daughter with eyes that were both loving and guarded. "Eat first," she said, "then we'll talk." Ava ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her throat tight with emotion, and when the plate was empty, she finally raised her eyes to meet her mother's gaze. "I don't know how to explain what happened to me," Ava began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know when I started seeing you as something to be ashamed of instead of someone to be proud of. I was so desperate to fit into Dylan's world, to prove that I belonged there, that I convinced myself your presence would ruin everything. I told myself I was protecting you, that you would be uncomfortable, but the truth is I was protecting myself. I was protecting the lie I had become. And when you showed up at the wedding, when you came even though I told you not to, I panicked. I made a choice that I will regret for the rest of my life. I had you thrown out, Mama. I had security remove you like you were nothing, like all the years of love and sacrifice meant nothing. And the worst part is that I knew it was wrong even as I was doing it. I knew, and I did it anyway." Marissa listened without interrupting, her face a mask of composure that barely concealed the pain beneath. When Ava finished, the silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, until finally Marissa spoke, and her words were measured and deliberate, each one chosen with care. "I saw the video," she said quietly. "Everyone saw it. I have had people from the village come to comfort me, to tell me how sorry they are for what happened, to share their own stories of children who forgot where they came from. And do you know what was hardest about watching that video? It wasn't the humiliation, though that hurt more than I can say. It was seeing how far you had drifted from the person I raised. I raised you to be kind, Ava. I raised you to understand that a person's worth is not measured by their wealth or their status, but by their character, by how they treat others, especially those who cannot offer them anything in return. And somewhere along the way, you forgot that, or maybe you never truly believed it." Ava's tears flowed freely now, and she made no attempt to wipe them away. You're right, she said, her voice breaking. I forgot everything you taught me. I was so caught up in becoming someone else that I lost myself completely, and it cost me everything. Dylan left me. His family accused me of theft and threw me out. I lost my job, my friends, my reputation. Everything I worked for, everything I sacrificed for, it's all gone, and I know I deserve it. I know that what I did to you was unforgivable, but I had nowhere else to go, Mama. I didn't come here expecting you to forgive me or take me back. I just needed to see you. I needed to tell you that I was wrong, that you were right about everything, and that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Marissa reached across the table and took Ava's hands in hers, and the gesture was so achingly familiar, so reminiscent of all the times she had comforted her daughter through disappointments and heartbreaks, that Ava nearly broke down completely. I forgive you, Marissa said, and the words hung in the air like a benediction. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because I'm your mother and I will always love you, even when you hurt me. But forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to the way it was, Ava. Trust has to be rebuilt. Respect has to be earned. You can stay here as long as you need to, but you have to understand that healing takes time, and it requires more than words. It requires change. Real, lasting change. Ava nodded through her tears, understanding the weight of what her mother was saying, accepting the conditions without hesitation. I'll do whatever it takes, she promised. I'll prove to you that I can be better, that I can be the daughter you deserved all along. And in that moment, sitting in the small kitchen where she had grown up, surrounded by the simple furnishings and the faint smell of her mother's cooking, Ava felt something she had not felt in months: hope. Not the shallow, desperate hope that had driven her to chase wealth and status, but a deeper, quieter hope rooted in the possibility of redemption, in the knowledge that even after the worst betrayal, love could survive if both people were willing to do the work. The days that followed were not easy. Ava helped with chores around the house, swept the floors and washed dishes and tended the small vegetable garden behind the house, tasks she had once considered beneath her but now approached with a humility born of genuine transformation. She found work at a local shop, earning barely enough to contribute to household expenses, but taking pride in the honest labor and the independence it represented. She began attending community gatherings, facing the whispers and judgmental stares of neighbors who had seen the video, enduring their scrutiny without complaint because she knew she had earned their disdain. And slowly, painfully, she began to rebuild her relationship with Marissa, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the small, consistent acts of presence and care that demonstrated her commitment to change. Months passed, and the viral video that had destroyed Ava's life gradually faded from public consciousness, replaced by newer scandals and fresher outrage. But the lessons Ava had learned remained, etched into her heart with the permanence of scars. She understood now that real wealth had nothing to do with money or status, that the truest measure of a person's success was the quality of their relationships and the depth of their integrity. She understood that the love of a parent was a gift beyond price, one that should be cherished and honored rather than taken for granted or hidden away out of shame. And she understood that home was not a place of marble and crystal, but wherever love was unconditional and forgiveness was possible, wherever someone waited with open arms even after you had walked away.